Hello there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Marche, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guest and get started, we do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we are thrilled to bring you today's educational presentation. A couple housekeeping items about our webinar today. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box, and the presenters will answer those queries during or after the webinar today as appropriate. And we do have a question and answer period at the end of today's presentation. If you ask a question in the chat box and we're not able to get to it, go ahead and leave your phone number as well. And if we can't get to your question during the event, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for expansion or clarification of the material. I'd love to introduce you to today's guests. And I just realized there, Chase, I put that you were the moderator, but you're also a presenter today. So we want to welcome both Chase and Julia today. Chase Tusshouse is a partner with Tusshouse Wealth Management. Prior to becoming a financial advisor, Chase worked in the manufacturing industry as an engineer for L3Harris and SpaceX. Chase graduated from the University of San Diego with the Bachelor of Arts and Science degrees in Industrial and Systems Engineering. He is a member of the University of San Diego Alumni Board, the co-chair of USD's Shiley Marcos School of Engineering and Computer Science Alumni Council, and a member of the Oceanside Theater Company Board of Directors. He and his wife, Julia, are parishioners at St. Charles Borromeo in Point Loma and spend their time mentoring local youth. Julia Tusshouse is an experienced school counselor in both private and public schools and an expert with UCEZ. She has an MA in counseling, psychology for school counseling, and she supports a diverse population of students with the college application process and achieving their post-secondary goals by helping them procure offers of admissions to hundreds of schools, including nearly every Ivy League, UC, Cal State, and other top-rated institutions. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to our presenters, Chase and Julia.
All righty, welcome everyone. My name is Julia Tusshouse, as Marche gracefully introduced me, and we are going to get into the conversation of how to pay for college. This is obviously a very, very important topic for students and parents. This is something we all care about as people trying to fund our educations and to carry on in life, paying for college, and to get to that future career. It's very important. So we're going to start with a few basics and get into a couple more detail-oriented things, but a lot of this is going to be very overarching, just to give you an awareness of what goes into this whole concept of paying for college. So the first thing I want to address is types of expenses to expect. So sometimes there's this mystery number that families will see on college websites, or you'll just hear, sticker price, the big number of, oh, well, Columbia costs $70,000 a year. Well, what actually goes into that? So you can see from our little list here, these are the basics, tuition and fees. So there's a base price of tuition, which means the money that you're paying for those classes that your child will be taking or that you will be taking at a university. So that's paying for the actual educational. And then there's also fees, processing fees. There might be some additional university campus fees. So that's the overarching use of their educational system. Room and board is referring to eating and sleeping in college, basically. So that's like the rent and the grocery bill of college. So how much does it cost to sleep in a tiny dorm room in the middle of New York City? Well, it's going to be a lot more than in maybe a luxurious suite in Omaha, Nebraska. So room and board, those are really important things to consider when we're talking about that cost of living piece. But that's the rent and the grocery bill. How do I feed and allow my child to sleep with a roof over their head at college? Books and supplies. Books might be a little bit of an outdated term for us to include, but I promise some universities still do have bookstores and still do require textbooks. They might be virtual now. Or on a Kindle or a PDF version, something like that. But that still is something that they might want to consider, especially if you have a student wanting to go to art school. Supplies are going to be a lot more expensive, or if you have a biochemistry major child, maybe lab usage and the things they're going to need for organic chemistry might end up being a lot more expensive than maybe a psychology major who just needs to read some books every semester. So, as I well know. Books and supplies, those are things to consider to support that educational experience, those classes you're taking. And transportation. Transportation and other expenses, I'm going to lump those in a little bit together today because that's going to be all of those external things that just are part of, you're already raising this child, you're already know what it costs to make sure they get to high school right now every single day. And then all the other things that go into that. That could be if you are from a warmer place, let's say, you're in Miami right now, but then you're going to send your child to Michigan. They're going to need some different clothing. That also is going to include different costs with flights and planning ahead on, do you need to pay for a bus once you even get to that airport? All those other expenses and those just life expenses, living things. We as humans, what do we need to function and be in a professional and living environment? College includes all of those things. So that big sticker price could be including all of those things, not just what does it cost for me to send my kid here just to learn.
Yeah, excuse me. Thanks, Julia. So I will say, just real quick, it's a pleasure to be here. My co-presenter, who doubles as my wife, told me to not repeat her today, so I will try to keep things, as efficient as we can. But yeah, everything we're talking about here, that's the cost of attendance, the sticker price, right? I was confused to see books on here. I'm not sure if I ever bought books when I was in college, but I think that is recommended. But I think when we're breaking down all the expenses, this is good because what we need to do is we need to create a budget upfront before we go and determine, what kind of a college can we afford. It'd kind of be like buying a home without essentially getting pre-approved. This is a large purchase, and so understanding where our budget falls will really help us as we kind of tackle what's the best fit as far as college for our students.
The thing is, keep in mind, I already threw out that term sticker price. So sticker price means that big, very usually large looking number, especially for just American institutions. That's the overall number that they advertise on the website. What is the cost of tuition at this university? So that's the sticker price. That's not necessarily the cost of attendance or what it's going to end up being after you factor in all of the different forms of aid, scholarships that might be awarded, things that we'll get into a little bit more moving forward through this presentation. So we just wanted to highlight that the sticker price can be misleading. That isn't something, don't rule out a university necessarily when you start this research just because of a sticker price, because it could be that this institution is really, really healthy with scholarships and grants, that they really acknowledge where their students and the families are coming from with need based on, family's income and also a student's academic performance. Who are they going to be and contribute onto their campus? There's a lot of scholarships and grants available for students out there based on things that they're going to bring to that college. So keep in mind that statistic, that 31% can be paid for based on scholarships and grants. And then also that a lot of private institutions in particular, because I know that has a bit of a negative connotation. A lot of families jump to, I'll just go to the big public school in my state, or I'll go to the local, public school. That's just easy. It'll be the cheapest option possible. Not necessarily. There's a lot of contextual things that go into that. The big public school in Los Angeles is going to be a heck of a lot more expensive. Like I said, to a Nebraska, to a Michigan, to an Idaho, where cost of living is very different. So tuition and room and board are going to be a lot cheaper in those places. And then also private schools, they really do want to encourage students to come to them. So they're going to try to meet you where you're at. It's going to depend on the university, but a lot of them do discount their tuition a lot and have really healthy scholarships and grants available.
Yeah, and I think what we're saying here is like, this is good news, right? I think the problem really is people don't know how to shop for college, right? There are schools out there that if we do some proper and appropriate planning up front and some research, that we can find something that will discount tuition or will help us afford a lot of what that sticker price might be. And I think to get there, as a former engineer, I certainly appreciate formulas. And so there's a few things here in a very simple formula that we like to look at. So we understand our cost of attendance. That's all the expenses we've been talking about. And what we'll be kind of talking about next is this expected family contribution. And that's just basically your student's contribution plus the parent's contribution, right? That's what a lot of the Fafsa and CSS stuff that we'll talk about later sort of leads us to. But then it's just a basic needs analysis formula of cost of attendance minus the expected family contribution, and that's the financial need. So kind of dive into that a little bit more, but just kind of be considering this as we're breaking down. Okay, now that we understand the expenses, kind of what's next. So
I just wanted to break in here, just a little housekeeping note. We did have couple questions already. I just want the participants to know I am keeping a list of those. We'll bring them up at appropriate times. So go ahead and if you have a question, put it in the chat, and I'm happy to keep track of those.
Thanks, Marcia.
So school selection. This is kind of going back to what Chase just said about, picking schools and knowing how to shop for schools and considering it, like pre-approving for a house, knowing which one is actually going to be a good fit for my family financially. So researching statistics on their website and looking at that financial aid and scholarships tab that is on every college website. It's a really, really good place to start. That's going to give you the basic information on what they provide and what a college is willing to advertise and what they show that they value and they promote. So if you're clicking on if that financial aid and scholarships tab is very readily available, it's one of the first things on the website, that that's something they want you to be drawn to. Then if you click in there and they say that over 80% of their students are on some form of financial aid or tuition assistance, then additionally, that's a statistic that they're willing to brag about, and they really want families shopping for colleges to know that that's something that they prioritize and are willing to support. So look at how they set up their websites. Look at how they're advertising. Different schools are going to be more generous with financial aid over others, depending upon a lot of factors of their own, income and endowments and things that they can pull from, or if it's a public school, the state, how much the state's giving to them for them to run. So the things that you want to look for are definitely what they put and what they advertise and what they prioritize. And that's going to also be really good baseline questions to ask any college representative. So at a certain point in your college research process, I think there's a taboo on, contacting the school and talking to college representatives or contacting their financial aid office. And that is a complete myth. They want to hear from you. They have people and representatives in their offices that if let's say your student is a senior and they already have all their acceptances and you have their financial aid offer letters written out and you're trying to pick between which one's best and maybe we can get a little bit more out of a college, it's never going to hurt to ask. The worst thing that could happen is that they say no and then their offer stands the same. But you're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to research further, and you're allowed to talk to a college rep about their different scholarship opportunities and find out more information. That's why they exist. So it doesn't need to be an awkward thing to ask questions about.
Yeah, definitely. And from a financial perspective, I think what you'll see is there's essentially two phases of all this, right? You have a saving component, which is, from 0 to, let's just say 14 years. And then when your student is 14 to 18, this component here where we're trying to, is kind of what we're talking about right now, like where we want to say like, okay, how are we going to figure out, on top of all of our savings and everything, what is the best ways to put together to then be able to decrease that cost of attendance. And so, I mean, for us, you know, there are platforms out there. We use a specific one that allows us to compare and contrast different schools and, you know, the percentages of students receiving financial aid and maybe what might be a comparable school. And so those resources are out there. But I think from that financial perspective, the big thing the idea to consider here is, you know, we all want what's best for our children. You know, Julie and I, we do, but we shouldn't sacrifice our retirements or, you know, stuff that's going to put us in a really bad situation later on, simply to put our student through school, because there are other options. You know, there's a way to still give them a really good education without then sacrificing your entire financial future for. So just wanted to emphasize that, but I think we're good to move on to the next slide here. Julie, did you want to intro?
Yeah, I can kick this off before you take over. I'm sure all of you are noticing that we are a very you know, balance of I'm the school counselor perspective and always want to be talking about the college aspect and making sure your students find their fit. And then I've got my financial master over here to fill in my blanks. So thank you all for hanging in there with us as we tag team. The FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Thankfully, it is a free application. We're very thankful that they do not charge you to fill this thing out because it is already a headache to begin with. But it is a very incredibly important resource for your students and is the main driving force for getting the financial aid process started in the fall of their senior year. So this application is available to students in October of their senior year. You cannot fill it out before. There's no accessing it necessarily until your child has gotten to that point, but you can start looking into it and looking ahead and you know, researching what its purpose is. And basically it's an application to qualify for aid from the federal government. So that's going to include grants and loan opportunities to be able to pay for college. So the way that I always, you know, try to describe it to my students is that, you know, they're going to fill it out and parents are going to fill it out. It's all the same application. And then it sends to the government, they analyze it, and then they send it off to your schools for all the colleges you're going to apply to figure out what to do with that information and how much are you going to qualify for from federal grants and loans, and how are they going to start the whole process of piecing together your financial aid package. So the FAFSA is a major driving force for schools in order for you to figure out what you'll be able to qualify for.
Yeah, and so now from a financial perspective, the FAFSA is very important, you know, and it's actually one of two different methodologies. There's actually, I think, even a third, but two of the main methodologies that schools will look at. So the federal methodology is what's used to calculate your expected family contribution out of the FAFSA. And I think the number one thing to note is we're looking back. They call it the prior year's taxes. So 2 years, your taxes from that point, that's what the FAFSA is considering, right? So then when we look at that from a planning perspective, you know, there's certain things that we need to understand. Okay, let's just say an easy example to kind of comprehend here is selling a business. If you sell a business in that year versus maybe the year after, that could really change the amount of your expected family contribution might be, right? So just a few things that the FAFSA will consider, and keep in mind these are not only considerations, but they are essentially weighted. And the big thing with FAFSA is we're looking at earned income. We want to see bank accounts, those college saving vehicles, and really any kind of taxable investment account. So that might be a trust, right? Real estate investments. And let me clarify that real estate investments, right? The FAFSA is not going to look at your personal residence. We will look at, or FAFSA will look at, if you own a business that's over 100 employees, they will consider the value of that. And then other things like Social Security benefits or unemployment. But the things that they won't look at, as I mentioned, are personal residence, maybe life insurance, and then also retirement accounts. So when we're completing the FAFSA, we don't want to give them that information, right? Like we don't want to say, oh, but I have, you know, X amount in a 401k account, right? We don't want to say like, hey, this is the amount of my personal residence, et cetera. So So that's where a lot of that, when I talk about that phase two of being able to pay for college, that, okay, now we're entering our freshman year, we need to start preparing for the FAFSA. This is where you can work with a financial professional, a CPA, or an advisor to start planning ahead a little bit to understand what's the best way to be applying for the FAFSA.
And just to clarify, when you talk about freshman year, you mean freshman year of high school?
Of high school, yes. Thank you for making that point, Marche.
I did have a couple questions that came in that I don't want to wait till the end to bring
Okay.
up. So some of these strategies that you were talking about, maybe if you can address this question here, the amount of the family contribution always seems overstated. So the amount of aid my student qualifies is reduced significantly. So is this the way to fix this?
This is potentially where we could, right? It's hard to say specifically in that situation, without looking at the tax returns and kind of what information is being inputted. But this is a point where we could look at that and try to get a little bit more creative in how we're looking at the rest of our financial plan, to be able to incorporate this part to show that, like, hey, yes, this is our true expected family contribution, rather than I suppose putting in information here or planning in a certain way financially that makes it seem like, oh, you generated a lot of income in this year. And then the FAFSA is going to look at that and say, like, oh, well, great. Now you can afford a lot more in college.
And then I have one more question here. Does the FAFSA take the 529 into account and reduce eligibility for grants and loan possibilities?
Yeah. Technically, yes, right? Because that is college savings vehicles, which would be a 529 plan, would be considered. I believe the percentage is around like 5% is what they look at on assets. Don't quote me on that. I would have to go back and confirm, but it is the number one thing the FAFSA will look at is earned income, and then followed by some of those, like I said, college savings vehicles, the 529 plans. So if you have, a lot in a 529 plan, then obviously FAFSA would look at that and say, like, okay, great, you should be able to afford a little bit more than someone who has not saved anything. And now potentially scholarships could be, obviously granted differently in that scenario. So
You mean grants, not scholarships, correct?
grants, yes.
Grants and loans would be awarded. Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about the next one here.
CSS profile.
Right.
Yeah, Chase, you want to just take it over? Do you want me to give any 2 cents on it?
Yeah. You can, I guess the 2 cents, and here is where I was told probably not to interrupt, but essentially this is for private colleges. So the FAFSA, obviously, well, I think it's required by pretty much everyone, but for the CSS profile, this is primarily private schools. They're using what they call an institutional methodology. So it's a bit different from the way the FAFSA looks at it. They also look at the prior year taxes. And again, this is where proper planning can really help you out, because we're going to look at the earned income, bank accounts, college savings vehicles, trust accounts. Now we're going to look at family-owned businesses. Even if you don't have 100 employees, that's now a big factor potentially. Real estate investments and your personal residence. So now we're incorporating a lot more that these private schools are saying, like, well, you have these other assets, you could potentially afford more when it comes to your expected family contribution, right? One thing they don't look at is any sort of financial aid you receive. They don't incorporate that as separate. And what's interesting about this is schools can then pick from other variables. So they might say, well, we also want to see what you have in your retirement accounts. So this is where that differs. This is where maybe income won't be as stressed, but now the focus shifts to assets. So these are just things to consider when we're going through this. There is, and Julie, you could probably expound upon this a little bit more, but there's a consensus method which is used by a very small number of colleges, primarily the Ivies, where I think that's even taken to a whole nother level as far as like, home equity might be viewed much more significantly than in the other two profiles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the main thing with the CSS profile to highlight too is that there is like a degree in when we fill these out. FAFSA is for everywhere and everyone, and you need to fill out the FAFSA before you fill out a CSS profile. Also, they need to be filed together. And the CSS profile purpose, it's also to find more ways to get more access to institutional money. So the CSS profile doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. It's really meaning, even though it dives deeper from how Chase is setting it up. That's important things to know, but it also could be a way for you to qualify for more money, because the universities that use the CSS profile are schools with larger endowments. So we're talking private schools, more popular public universities. So there's only about 150 colleges that use the CSS profile, but it is a valuable tool to qualify for as much money from the school as possible. So that's kind of the end goal of it. And then the consensus model that you mentioned, Chase, but for the Ivies, Ivies are all striving to meet 100% need. That's a tenet that they really like to stand behind, and almost a bragging point a lot for those schools, because they know how pricey they are, but they're also that competitive to get into. So they want to make it accessible for students that qualify. They don't want finances to ever be a reason a student doesn't go to an Ivy League school. So they'll look at that to really make sure they're meeting 100% need based off all the details of the family's financial situation. Very specific to Ivy League universities, obviously, but and to any need, meeting 100% need university.
Cool. Yeah, so grants now. We're going to kind of get into a few of the, what are these? Okay, so we looked at FAFSA, CSS profile. This is going to tell us, what potential financial need we may have. So the first one here, grants, similar to scholarships. I think the big thing to note here is that this is specifically need-based financial aid. So it's stuff that does not need to be repaid, which is what our number one, what we should be looking for, right? And a few examples, obviously, like Pell Grants. You have grants for veteran service or maybe specific occupations. I think we listed the teacher education one here. And really, it, like I said, it's similar to scholarships, but when we're looking at it from a financial perspective, as much of this as we can obtain is great, because we don't have to repay it. So, Julie, if you wanted to add anything.
Oh, that's, yeah, grants also, actually, I will mention that you can apply for those. You can apply for grants and scholarships also through the college experience. So it's not like they have to apply to all of this as a high school student and that's it. Whatever the price is, that's going to remain throughout college. You file a FAFSA every single year, so the institution will reanalyze what your family's financial situation is every single year that your student enrolls in college. And then also there's additional grants and scholarships to apply for once your student's even in a university. And grants can often be found, not just the federal grants, but also the institutional grants. So wherever your child actually ends up at school, they might have their own money that will help fund their study abroad experience, that will fund certain research on campus, and will pay for a certain amount of credits towards their major. So it doesn't stop just because they're accepted into a school and they're enrolled. This process can continue to grow and evolve across the 4 to 6 to med school years.
Yeah, so it's Counterparts Scholarships. So scholarships are need-based and merit-based. So merit-based, these are just, you're recognized for outstanding academic performance or talents or leadership. Need-based, obviously, awards to those demonstrating financial need, which we saw out of FAFSA and the CSS. These are great because we also don't have to repay them. So yet again, something that when trying to figure out how do we, fill that financial need, grants, scholarships, those are going to be our top priority. So you certainly have, when I think of scholarships, I think of athletic scholarships, but when you break down the numbers, there's actually, I think it's only like around 1% of all scholarships awarded are athletic, which is probably good news for us. I know I'm not going to the NBA or the NFL or anything like that soon, so I would certainly need the academic, which might be another issue for me, right? And then I think you also, if you break down, because your school specifically can award a scholarship, and there's also private scholarships. And you see that around like 85% are sort of the institutional or the schools grants and scholarships. And then between like 13 and 15% are private scholarships. So so these help lower the cost of attendance versus like a loan or work study will help just pay for school. And I know I'll just touch briefly. When you are accepted to a school, you receive a kind of an awards letter if you're granted scholarships or potential work study or grants. And these are things you can appeal. So there's a certain way to do it. You don't want to be kind of hard negotiating with the school, but if you do it where it's coming from the student and you show a desire to be there and are specific in, hey, if I could get maybe $10,000 more in financial aid, I would accept the ability to come to your school. Julia, any other comments there? Scholarships in general?
No, I was going to mention these websites and explain a little bit more about some of these resources we have on the slide too. So all of these are going to be for those private or outside scholarships that Chase just mentioned. The biggest reason that scholarship money goes unaccessed and not utilized by students in our country is because they don't go through the motions and the effort to apply for them. So a very silly reason to not get a scholarship just because you don't want to write an additional 250-word essay, or you don't want to click a few buttons. So these resources, I do find that students get scholarship search fatigue because you can go to certain websites or certain lists that have hundreds of scholarships listed, and they keep clicking, and then they read the criteria, and then it's like, okay, well, that's for a very specific person studying a very specific thing in a specific age group. There's so many qualifying factors to these scholarships, which is why they're great, because you can meet a lot of them and the competition could be less, but then also it gets exhausting looking for scholarships you qualify for when the first 50 you clicked on were not meant for a person in your situation. So all of these websites in one way or another allow you to put in personal information about your student, and then it will pre-screen them for eligibility for scholarships. So it's a way to refine the search within the universe of scholarship databases out there, so that you don't have to be clicking through 3,000 to find the 100 that you qualify for. These websites will do it for you. Going Merry is one of my personal favorites just because of its platform and the information it also emails you. It gives you a lot of updated scholarships and reminds you when deadlines happen. So this is a really good thing for your student to get started on as soon as possible. It does not need to start in senior year. There are scholarships specifically for sophomores, specifically for juniors, that they will lose this opportunity to qualify for once they become an older student. So feel free to get that account going now and have your students start applying to scholarships now. That's one of doing well in school and then applying to scholarships are probably two of the best things that an underclassman can do in high school to help plan for college from a financial perspective.
All right, federal work study. So if the school you're attending is part of the federal work study program, your student, if the financial need is demonstrated, has the potential to be awarded the opportunity for work study. Now, I think what's important here is this is not guaranteed. Your student still needs to find a job, they need to apply, and they need to be accepted. So consider that when you might receive your award letter and it says, oh, X amount in work study, that needs to be taken with a grain of salt, right? So it doesn't always mean that those hours are there to work. And just so you understand a little bit kind of in how it works, the government is essentially paying for, I believe it's about 50% of the wage of your student. So that is, it's a good way to, again, help pay for the cost, but you're not necessarily lowering your cost of attendance. Julia, anything or?
Sounded good to me. Well done.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so next one, student loans, Parent Plus loans. So this is essentially the least desirable form of financial aid, and I think that can be, it's obvious, right? We don't want to necessarily put ourselves in debt and we really need to be cautious. So to break it down, we have two types of loans: subsidized loans and unsubsidized. The subsidized ones, and interest is essentially being paid while you're in school. The unsubsidized, that interest accrues, and then you'll start paying it after you've graduated, and it's time to start paying back your loans. And I think we just need to remember that, consider how much you're receiving in loans, what your expected payments will be, along with the income you can expect to make, or your student can expect to make, based on your desired major once they do graduate, right? And then it kind of becomes like a math formula here, right? If my student loan, monthly payment is this, but I'm only going to be making this, your student, okay, now we kind of have an issue. And that's where we want to look at this as an entire, we want to look at the entire, spectrum of all this, not just like, oh, good, a loan can help me afford to go to, whatever, the University of San Diego, which I would highly recommend. Won't necessarily, okay, now my student can go there, but then when you graduate, if you're drowning in debt, what did that really do for your student, right? So be cautious. That's what we want to say here, right? We want to understand, okay, we want the best for our children, but we also have to understand what we're going to give up to make that happen. So that's, again, thorough planning, finding that best fit, and just being cautious when it comes to student loans. Okay, 529 plans. I know I've had a few questions about this. This is one form of a savings vehicle for college, right? So we can, again, now we're shifting back into that first phase, that 0 to 14 years of your student's life, right? Where, okay, now we can start putting money away. There are ways that you can, if you have a grandparent who wants to gift money towards a 529 plan, doing that in a lump sum versus over several years. So there's things like that, but essentially a 529 plan, it's a tax advantage savings plan. So the idea is you're going to be putting money away, saving towards education. Now the tax treatment, when it comes time that your student enters school and they're able to start, maybe they need the funds that we've saved in a 529 plan, they can make those withdrawals tax-free as long as they're used for qualified higher education expenses. Okay, so what does that mean? We're talking tuition, fees, books, supplies, equipment, room and board, and the student has to be, at a minimum, a part-time student, like half their time has to be dedicated towards being a student. So these are also what's kind of nice about the 529 plans. Okay, so you have each of the states, they're essentially, they will sponsor their own 529 plans. Some offer even additional benefits as far as maybe like income tax reductions on your state return, right? If you're a resident there. So others might then offer more investment options if that's what you're looking for. So it's important to not only consider your home state, but also look around, what other states are out there, and see based on like what you're looking for. Okay, hey, gives us the best opportunity to save in a 529 plan. 529 plans, if you have multiple children, they can be rolled from one child to the next. If the first child maybe, well, unlike me, my brother got a full ride scholarship to play football, so he didn't need anything from his 529. So had I been younger, my parents could have been rolled those funds into my name, and I could have used those towards college expenses, or I should say qualified educational expenses. I think this is, you have other opportunities to save in maybe UTMAs. People have talked about doing it in IRAs or Roth IRA conversions, in different trust accounts. I mean, keep in mind, those don't have the same tax benefits. That's why we specifically wanted to talk about 529 plans. That's about, without getting too deep in the weeds here, kind of a high level on 529 plans. Any questions, Marche, specifically?
Yeah, I do have some 529 questions here. So this is a really good one. Is it fair to assume that high income families won't qualify for, I think they meant grants, not scholarships, but grants. And so 529s are the only likely option to reduce the college expenses burden?
Yeah, I will say it obviously depends, there's your, but it is a great way, and probably, a lot would argue one of the best ways to save and help reduce that cost, or help, excuse me, pay for that cost of college later on. So the earlier you can start contributing, and so I kind of mentioned the lump sum versus the monthly, or sorry, yeah, monthly or annual contributions. The more you can get in there, the sooner, the more you'll allow those funds to grow, right? And so it is a really good way, and probably one of the first things when we're working with families that we say, okay, if a goal is paying for education, let's open a 529 plan now, because you can also use those for K through 12 education expenses as well. So something else to consider.
So you would say that 529s are the best practice in general.
I would say they're one of the best.
One of the best. Okay, great.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about when we went back to like what a qualified education expenses in 529s? You went over that most of those college expenses that we went over are covered. What things wouldn't be covered?
Oh gosh, what, specifically, I mean, I would have to, some of those other expenses, that we kind of talked about would be the big ones. Like if you're in Miami and you're going to school in Michigan, they're not going to pay for your clothes, right? So kind of things like that. I mean, but the basics, like the big expenses, like tuition, room and board, then the book supplies. Those are the things to kind of really focus on, and then the rest are, I don't know if the IRS is going to give you that one. So,
is it safe to say that it's the the serious requirement money, not the fun money that usually comes with college? Maybe
yeah,
things like that.
You could call it that. Yeah, they're not going to, I don't know, maybe pay for a trip to, oh, maybe study abroad. I don't know. That's a little iffy, but yeah, there's some of the stuff that's not directly related to the education, the school's expenses. It's not going to qualify. But I will say, please consult your CPA to confirm.
Very good. Can you talk a little bit more about, I have some more specific questions about 529s, but we're going to keep moving and hold those to the end.
Okay.
I think some of these questions that are coming in, if you're very specific, we're going to refer you to your financial advisor. But I will acknowledge that we've received your questions and we can reach out to you after today's event as well.
All right. So working while in college, this is probably something a lot of us have had to do, right? To just help supplement college or university expenses, college expenses, just sort of living expenses as well. This also comes down to being able to find a job, applying and getting accepted. I would say the one thing with this, sometimes, I was blessed with the opportunity to have internships, a couple of them throughout my experience. So not only did they help me pay for some of my educational expenses, but also gave me the experience I needed in my field at that time as an engineer. So I know that was a big bonus. I think, Julia, if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, that's the baseline that I would say. And the only comment I was going to mention is that for the tuition reimbursement, that generally applies to graduate programs, not undergrad. So if that is something that you're asking, or looking ahead, that's usually for a master's degree or a continuing education experience that an employer or company will say like, yeah, we'll pay for your MBA or something like that. Very field dependent and usually degree dependent.
All right, well, we've come to the question and answer period. And so I have a bunch of questions here. We'll get started on them. We'll go as much as we can. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and pop those in the chat. If we don't have a chance to get to them, please leave your contact information in there and we will save that and reach out to you after today's event. So here's one. Yeah, you said before that different schools are more generous with financial aid. Is that statistical data readily available online?
I would say that that depends on the formatting. Yes, that data is absolutely available online, but you have to do the digging. You have to usually go into the specific university's websites and get direct information from their financial aid office and even just the data from their most recent admitted class and their current students. So it is available on there. Some schools are much more forthcoming than others. That kind of goes back to my initial philosophy slide of if the school is willing to share that and really promote that and is transparent, that's going to be a university that's more willing to work with you than one that maybe they need to cover their bases. Maybe they don't have as much money to work with and offer, and they don't promote those statistics as readily. So that's going to tell you more about the inner workings and the personality of the university, if it's available or not.
Yeah, and I will say, as a kind of add on to that, so myself, our firm, we're a certified college financial consultant. So with that, that's a designation that a lot of advisors could potentially have. So within that network, they do, there's some platforms in there, some resources that if your advisor is also certified, that they can access, that kind of helps group some of that info together. So that might be an option as well.
So I have a great question about a attendee has a 7-year-old right now, and they ask, how do you set up automatic savings from your salary?
Yeah,
for college.
Yeah, so you can definitely do that, right? It's what we would typically recommend. We just recently set up one where a client of ours wanted to be putting away X amount over the next couple of years, and then they at that point they knew they'd have paid off some debt and then wanted to start shifting that money to increasing more contributions to their 529. It's fairly easy depending on who you're working with. You can set up. It wouldn't necessarily come out of your paycheck before you received it. It would have to go into your bank account, and then you could just say, hey, the 1st of the month or the 15th of the month, whenever you get paid, that money just automatically is drawn out. So there are ways to do that. Depends on your advisor, who they use as their custodian, and all that. But certainly is what we would recommend if you couldn't make a lump sum.
So here's a question. We have a second property that we're planning to sell and use the funds for college. Our child is a high school freshman. Should we sell it this year instead of waiting closer to senior year?
Yeah, so that depends, right? There's a lot of things to consider there. You certainly want to look at the entire financial picture, right? Because if you sell that now in hopes to pay for college later, so you can decrease your Fafsa, expected family contribution, but then you generate a ton of taxes and selling that, did we do the right thing? So there's a lot to consider there. That is, though, something that, yeah, you want to ask that question. You want to know, hey, if we sold this now, what are the ripples? What does that decrease, at least in the first couple of years, potentially, right? Like, maybe we could decrease our expected family contribution. We take the proceeds of that, we can dump it into a 529 plan or some sort of savings vehicle, allow that to grow for the next couple of years, and then start using it towards college. So with the market down, with a down market, it's a great opportunity to be investing. So it just depends, I guess, is what, based on the other financial factors that go into that scenario. So
is there best practices about how much to save for college?
Yeah, what's your budget? It's that it also, that's why it has to be a piece to the overall financial plan, right? Like this is, and a lot of financial plans will just kind of say, okay, let's look at how much we expect college to be, and hopefully we increase our assets enough so we can be able to cover those expenses. But there's there's no hard rule, I would say, as far as hey, contribute X amount of your paycheck, and that's what you should be saving. If you need to make sure you check the other boxes too, right? Like, don't let the tail wag the dog, right? Make sure you're saving for retirement. Make sure if you have debt, you're paying off debt. Make sure you're doing the other things that you need to get done, right? And included in that is education. So then, based on this budget, if you have savings going this way and this way, okay, now we have X amount that we can start putting towards educational expenses. So it is something that you do want to break down and just know, okay, if I put all my money into a 529 plan and then both my kids get full ride scholarships, I now have a 529 plan that's fully funded that now I'm going to have to pay taxes on top of penalties to then take that money out to use it for potentially retirement or other things that if you hadn't planned appropriately for.
I would also add to that, it will depend on the flexibility of your family and your student, because there is such a wide range of how much college can attend, from the full ride to many families have paid the full sticker price of $70,000 a year for the top most expensive universities in the most expensive cities. So if your student is, depends on how they perform, what they're going to qualify for at their particular list of universities. So an averaging out number might be something, just conceptually a good thing to hit, depending on, like Chase said, your family's overall experience. But I have students that maybe, the Ivies and the really competitive, really expensive New England private schools are their goal. But if they're flexible and they're more willing to go to that, other tier of universities that might be less competitive, but offer way better scholarships and are much better at meeting that financial need, if they're willing to maybe sacrifice that dream super competitive 5% acceptance rate school that might not be paying for a lot for them for that middle tier school, then you're not going to need as much money saved, and so there's flexibility there. But if you're like, I want to get every opportunity possible, if they do get into the Harvard, Harvard will meet your needs. That's probably a bad example. But if you do get into that really, University of Miami, competitive university right now, very expensive, and you want to be able to pay for that, then obviously you want to be saving more. But I think Chase's rule of thumb of looking at everything you're doing is always going to be in your best interest.
Yeah, and I think that's where Julie and I have been able to work with families that, okay, we talk in the early years about saving, and we kind of figure that out with a general expectation of, I want my kids to go to a private school, or I want them to be able to, essentially afford college on their own, but I'll keep a stash of savings that I'm not going to essentially tell them about, kind of help teach like financial principles, right? But then as they get into those high school years, or even like, I guess, 8th grade, going into those years, then trying to like Julia working with them to figure out like, hey, what are we interested in? How can we best present ourselves when it comes to applying to colleges, right? And then understanding, okay, now what can we afford? And then coming up with, okay, here are the dream schools, but also here's a list of very similar, potentially good fit alternatives that we need to consider as well. And so when you're working hand in hand like that, I think that's where you're going to get the most benefit out of this entire process, and probably be set up for a really good experience from the parents' perspective, as far as affording it and coming out of college without, breaking the bank, right? And the students' perspective of really enjoying their college experience, getting the most out of it, and then coming out with a great degree in the earning potential that they're looking for.
I have another question on 529s. And this is a little more specific, but I'll try to generalize it so that we can get this specific, kind of get this to this particular person, but also to everyone here. So as far as the 529, it's invested in an aggressive track, does switching to a moderate growth track seem more wise, depending on the climate of the market?
Yeah, I would say the biggest factor is, when do you need the money, right? So if the market is, if you're invested aggressively, going into knowing that you're going to need that money in the following year for education, but maybe it's time to consider paring some of that risk down, right? I mean, without knowing the entire situation, really the more time horizon you have, probably the greater amount of risk you can take. And if you know that you don't need that money for at least several years, I would continue to allow it to, potentially grow as much as it can. And then as you get closer, the worst thing not the worst, oh, a really bad thing you could do is let it be aggressively invested going into maybe the next year that you need it, and you might have a big market turn down. Something like that, where then now you're losing some of the ability to pay for college. That would be, oh no, now we're hurting ourselves, right? So I think I would just say time horizon, and also your own uh, risk capacity, because if you're not comfortable taking on a lot of risk and letting that money grow, then I'd recommend you don't do that. So
I have a couple more questions about scholarships, and then we're going to have to end. We did have a question about whether we'll be able to share this recording. Yes, every attendee will get a link to our website where we will post the recording. And Chase and Julia have also offered 2 other webinars about the college application process, and also just college planning in general, and selecting colleges and being prepared for that. So I will make sure to link those in or on the page on our website. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and talk about these questions on scholarships. So can you talk about merit-based scholarships in particular, as opposed to need-based? Are there ones that should be at the top of the list?
So the main difference, again, between merit and need-based, merit is going to be based on your students' application and information and things intrinsically about them, or what they're going to put for college. So their GPA, their test scores, activities, essays that they submit, letters of recommendation. Scholarships can be based off of a lot of criteria. Some are very simple. For example, University of Arizona and University of Alabama, you have a certain GPA, you qualify for a certain amount of money. That's just their baseline merit-based scholarship. It used to be a grid with test scores also. COVID's done a lot to test scores. Please see our other webinars for more information on that. But that's basically what a merit-based scholarship is going to be. Some universities are very simple, where it's just a meet this and you'll earn this. Some are going to be more, you'll see them titled the dean's or the presidential, or somebody, an alumni's name scholarship, and you have to meet certain criteria. So you have to write an essay, you have to prove that you've given back to your community, you have to show that you have a certain number of hours of service in a certain field, and what have you done to contribute to maybe a certain social change. So all those merit-based scholarships will be very different. Many of them are, your student will be automatically pre-screened for them in the college application process, so that you don't need to click any extra buttons or submit anything extra. They'll just read your student's application, and if based on the application information, they seem like a candidate for a certain scholarship, they'll be automatically screened, and that will be awarded when they receive their acceptance. Other scholarships that you can apply for might require an additional essay, or a little bit of additional effort, certain honors college, opportunities. And then for need-based, need is always going to be based on income. It's going to be based on that FAFSA and CSS profile information. That is how you qualify for need-based scholarships. It'll be a certain, it's a little bit more technical on certain thresholds, what your family can afford, what you have to offer, and what the school, where they want to meet you in the middle with that. So if you have financial need, you can qualify for those scholarships. Merit is going to be based on your student's performance.
So here's a follow-up question. I think this is going to be our last question that we can ask. Are all merit-based scholarships school-specific, or are there like any generic merit-based scholarship applications that several schools look at?
Oh, that is a good question. It's really going to be very different between school specific and then there's outside in general. So there's going to be outside scholarships where that money is provided by a company or a nonprofit or something, something else is funding that can follow you to either a specific set of universities or to any university you attend. So there's very general ones, like a Coca-Cola scholarship is going to follow you to no matter what university you go to. Then there's certain Golden State scholarships that can only apply for if you're a California student going to a university in Oregon. So again, that's why those databases, those research links are very important to glean through and to have your student create an account, because it starts to narrow those things down. It'll identify, oh, you are a student in Michigan who wants to be going to this school over here. You could qualify for this. Certain school districts will have certain scholarships for their own local public schools. So scholarships can be a lot of different things. So it's hard to have a hard and fast rule about them, but merit-based is really, that's just a phrase to distinguish between merit and need-based. So merit can also be to describe outside scholarships as well as those specific school scholarships. They'll be based on your student's merit, your student's performance, what your student has to offer to either this company, this nonprofit, or to the university that they're attending.
All right. Well, what great information. Thank you, both of you, for being here. Thank you for our attendees for attending. I'll do a little bit of a outro here, and then we'll hopefully see you at another webinar. On behalf of Advice Chaser, I do want to thank the speakers and the organizations that have made this webinar possible today. And attendees, look for an email with a link to the replay of this event. That should, and you're welcome to share that email and that replay with your friends and family. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for you and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. We're getting lots of thank yous and appreciation from the audience. I just wanted to let Chase and Julia know as we're getting all these thank yous in. Thank you for attending. And once again, from Advice Chaser, we will see you at another webinar very soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.